Everyone thinks the CIA's greatest Cold War victory was stealing Soviet secrets from Moscow. They're wrong. The real breakthrough happened 600 feet underground, in a place that technically didn't exist, beneath a city divided by barbed wire and ideology. What we've been told for decades is that American and British intelligence pulled off a masterpiece of engineering, a tunnel dug directly under Soviet lines in Berlin, packed with wiretapping equipment that gave the West an unprecedented window into Russian military communications. It sounds like the ultimate spy thriller. And for the first half of the Cold War, historians accepted it as fact, no questions asked. But here's where the story gets complicated. In 1956, American and British engineers began construction on what they called Operation Gold or Operation Stopwatch, depending on which side of the Atlantic you asked. The mission was audacious: tunnel from West Berlin into the Soviet sector, intercept underground telephone and telegraph cables, and record everything without the Russians knowing. For nearly a year, the operation ran. Thousands of conversations were captured. Reams of intelligence flowed back to Washington and London. The intelligence was staggering: Soviet military orders, Kremlin strategy, Red Army communications. Western analysts believed they'd finally cracked open the Soviet mind. This telegram right here, one of thousands declassified decades later, shows just how detailed the intercepts were. Officers' names, unit movements, weapons capabilities. The tunnel seemed to justify every dollar spent on it. For years, the operation was treated as a triumph. The CIA and MI6 had done the impossible. They'd built a secret passage into enemy territory and harvested months of pristine intelligence without detection. The Soviets, it seemed, had no idea. That's the version that went into the history books. That's the version that shaped how we understood American espionage capabilities during the Cold War. Except the Soviets knew. They knew almost from the beginning. And that changes everything about what Operation Gold actually was, and what it tells us about intelligence, deception, and the real nature of the Cold War. The truth didn't emerge until the 1990s, when declassified documents and defector testimonies revealed the stunning reality. The tunnel had been compromised before it was ever finished. The man responsible was named George Blake, a British intelligence officer, fluent in Russian, working inside MI6 Berlin station. Blake had been recruited by the Soviets in 1951, just 5 years before the tunnel began. When the Americans and British started planning Operation Gold, Blake knew about it. When they broke ground, he reported it. When they began collecting intelligence, he was photographing every transcript. The Soviets faced a dilemma. If they arrested the tunnel operators, they'd reveal that Blake was their source, and they'd lose him as an asset. Blake was still valuable, still inside MI6, still seeing everything. So they made a calculated decision: let the tunnel operate, monitor it, let the Americans and British believe they were winning, collect intelligence on what the West knew and what the West was thinking. In April 1956, the Soviets staged a discovery of the tunnel. They called in the press. They photographed the equipment. They made a show of shutting it down. The Americans and British were shocked, or appeared to be. The operation was over. The intelligence stopped flowing, and Western analysts assumed they'd been found out. What they didn't know was this: the Soviets had already gotten what they needed from Blake. They'd learned how much the West knew about their military. They'd learned what America's priorities were in Berlin. They'd learned the names of other agents, other operations, other vulnerabilities. And they'd done it while keeping Blake in place, still feeding them intelligence for another 5 years. The real question becomes, whose victory was Operation Gold? The American narrative says it was a triumph. They got months of priceless intelligence before being discovered. The Soviet narrative, once revealed, suggests something else entirely. They controlled the entire operation. They fed the West information they wanted known. They protected an asset worth far more than any tunnel. This isn't just about who outsmarted whom. This is about a fundamental truth of espionage that the tunnel revealed. Sometimes the most valuable intelligence isn't what you steal. It's what you let your enemy believe they've stolen. The Soviets didn't need to stop the tunnel. They needed to let it run long enough to understand American and British thinking, then close it in a way that made the West feel discovered, not deceived. Blake was eventually caught not because of the tunnel, but because of a Soviet defector's testimony in the 1960s. By then, he'd been passing secrets to Moscow for over a decade. He received a 42-year sentence in a British prison. He escaped in 1966 and lived the rest of his life in the Soviet Union, dying in Moscow in 2020, still insisting he'd done the right thing. The tunnel itself became a relic. The entrance was sealed. The equipment was removed. For decades, the site was just another piece of Cold War Berlin, buried, forgotten, waiting. It wasn't rediscovered until the wall fell in 1989, when the divided city was whole again, and historians could finally walk the ground and ask, what really happened here? What Operation Gold teaches us is that the Cold War wasn't won by the side with the best technology or the deepest tunnels. It was shaped by people like Blake, idealists, traitors, or both, depending on your perspective, who understood that information flows both ways. The West got intelligence from the tunnel. The Soviets got something more valuable, insight into how the West thought. This document here, one of the declassified assessments from decades later, finally acknowledged what historians had missed, that the tunnel's greatest value wasn't the intelligence collected, but the window it provided into Soviet counterintelligence strategy. The West learned how the Soviets thought. The Soviets learned how the West thought, and neither side fully understood they were being watched. The implications ripple forward to today. Every intelligence operation, every secret intercept, every covert mission exists in a space where both sides might be playing a longer game than anyone realizes. Operation Gold didn't fail because it was discovered. It succeeded because it was controlled, and the West didn't know the difference until it was far too late. The tunnel is gone now, but the lesson remains. In espionage, victory isn't always what it seems. Sometimes the greatest triumph is convincing your enemy they've won. Subscribe for more declassified Cold War cases, each one rewriting the history you thought you knew.